Italy, the center of the great Roman Empire, the year 79 AD. On a hot summer evening, people in the capital city of Rome witness a strange phenomenon. A gray substance, almost like dirty snow, falls from the sky over the city. But this is not a snowstorm. 120 miles to the south, a smoldering volcano, Mount Vesuvius, has erupted in a burst of molten rock and ash. It was a disaster of apocalyptic scale. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which had lived in the mountain's shadow for generations, crumbled into ruin. The people of these cities were condemned to a cruel fate, almost too horrible to imagine. Blinded by red-hot ash and choked by poisonous gases, they died one by one. As the eruption continued, their bodies were slowly buried in the layers of boiling mud and pumice until no trace of life or civilization remained. Never before in recorded history had such a densely populated area been victim to such a catastrophe. As time passed, these once vibrant cities faded from the memory of later generations. All that remained were their names on ancient maps and some artwork and treasures attributed to the cities. And thus, one of the greatest mysteries of history was born. For over 16 centuries, scholars and art lovers searched to unravel the mysteries of these lost cities. What had happened? They knew the answer lay buried deep within the earth, but no one knew where. Until a peasant farmer in the early 18th century happened upon one of the greatest finds in the history of archaeology. A vast chasm had opened in the ground near his field, revealing the remains of an ancient structure. An expedition was organized to explore the underground ruins. Suddenly, a light from an explorer's torch fell on a plaque inscribed with Latin characters. From a single word, Herculanensis, archaeologists realized that they had stumbled across the theater in Herculaneum, one of the cities that had been wiped out by Vesuvius. An ancient riddle was solved at last. It was an incredible discovery. And today, almost 300 years later, objects like this glass jar are still being discovered when archaeologists brush away the hardened mud. But such findings pale next to other more dramatic discoveries, like these skeletons of some of the former inhabitants of Herculaneum who did not manage to get away in time. Before its fall, Herculaneum was a prosperous city, as seen in the beauty of its houses, many of which had a lavishly decorated atrium. Dozens of bronze statues have been found in many of the villas and are today preserved in the National Museum in Naples. These findings, lost for nearly 2,000 years, now form one of the world's greatest collections of bronze art. But the most important discovery took place inside the so-called Villa of the Papyri, which is still partially buried under layers of volcanic rock. An entire library with thousands of ancient scrolls. Carbonized but intact, these documents are still being unrolled by experts, so their contents can be deciphered. The finding of the papyri in the mid-1700s fueled the search for another lost city, Pompeii. It too was discovered by chance in 1756, a few years after Herculaneum. Even today, parts of Pompeii are still buried under volcanic rock, though most of its treasures have been brought to light. Despite the devastation by Vesuvius, a number of frescoes survived that helped put a face on this ancient civilization. This portrait of a wealthy merchant and his wife could represent any of the more than 10,000 inhabitants of the city. It was at this unimposing site between Via Stabiana and the now famous Via dell'Abbondanza that the remarkable painting was found. As archaeologists excavated the remains of this house, they found a portrait of the owner on the wall of a room. The fresco contained one small but noteworthy detail. The woman portrayed at her husband's side was holding a waxed tablet, which at the time was used for writing. Scholars deduced that the woman may have kept the books in the shop she ran with her husband. Not unlike some families today, the couple operated their business, a successful bakery and sales outlet, out of their own home. Despite all the advances of modern civilization, it is remarkable how little the basics of everyday life have changed in 2,000 years. Whereas today the shopping mall has become a major focal point of social and commercial activity, in Roman times it was the Forum. Traffic and congestion were an issue then, even as they are now, and so the center area was ingeniously designed to be a pedestrian-only zone. Citizens would come here to take part in the public and social life of the city, or simply to enjoy a stroll with family or friends. The raised steps of the arcade weren't just for appearance. They were also to prohibit chariots, so visitors wouldn't have to worry about being run over by horses. In Pompeii, as in every Roman city, the Forum was the center of religious, political, and commercial life. The city's administrative offices and archives were situated in this square. Nearby was the Comitium, a place where male citizens went to cast their ballots. Though women were an important part of Roman society, they did not have the right to vote. But they could, much like today, have a strong influence on the view of their husbands. On the right-hand side of the Forum stood a building owned by the wealthy noblewoman Umecchia, who was descended from an influential Pompeii family. Nearly 26,000 square feet in area, it was one of the largest buildings in the Forum, roughly half the size of a football field. Archaeologists believe it was probably an important market where people could buy clothing and material, especially wool. One surprising discovery was the unearthing of these structures set near the entrance to the building. It may sound incredible, but experts believe them to be urinals, where the urine of visitors was collected to be used in bleaching and softening the wool. In a prominent location at the center of the Forum stood the Temple of Jove, or Jupiter. Standing over 40 feet high, it was the largest religious building in the city, with 6 columns along the facade. Of the temple's many statues, all that has survived is this head of Jove, the original of which is kept in the National Museum in Naples. Though little of the building remains, enough is known about it that it is possible to visually recreate its original splendor. In its time, this was the most important monument in Pompeii. The entire area of the Forum looked like this, with twin-level colonnades and the Temple of Jupiter in the background. Here also was one of the biggest schools in Pompeii, with classes held under these porticos. It seems discipline was a lot stricter in those days. This fresco shows a pupil being flogged by his teacher while classmates look on. In this open classroom, no one dared to complain. Pupils sat on the ground and teachers held the lessons outdoors with little regard to weather conditions. And in addition to all that, there was always a crowd of people and street vendors going about their business. To the left of the Forum lay the Temple of Apollo. It was a very popular place of worship because Apollo was considered to be the guardian deity of Pompeii. In addition to paying him tribute, people came here to use the sundial atop this column. Apollo was the god who regulated harmony and equilibrium, and thus also the passage of time. Not surprisingly, his temple was revered above all others except that of Jupiter, Apollo's father. One of the places most often visited in Roman times was the thermal baths. Built in 80 BC, the baths had separate entrances for men and women and also separate sections for bathing. This room was known as the tepidarium, a place where guests were always in hot water, so to speak. Its pool was donated by an industrialist from Capua named Marcus Nigidius Vacula, who made very certain everyone knew the gift was from him. In this room, with its ceiling open to the sky, was the pool of the frigidarium. It was filled with cold water, into which bathers plunged after having a hot sauna. Pompeii was built in the form of an oval about 2 miles around. A great wall with 7 gates surrounded the city. At this intersection once stood the temple of Fortuna Augusta, dedicated to the emperor's lucky star. Beside it was a portico with houses where people lived, and in the background was the arch dedicated to the Emperor Caligula. Historians today are able to recreate the appearance of these buildings in great detail, a tribute to modern science and archaeology. Like all Roman cities, Pompeii had an amphitheater where gladiators fought. The amphitheater in Pompeii is one of the oldest in the entire Roman world. Here in this very stadium, in the year 59 AD, an event took place that was destined to provoke the intervention of the Emperor Nero himself. During one of the contests, bloody and violent fighting broke out among the spectators themselves. Many were killed. Enraged by the scandal, Emperor Nero ordered the amphitheater closed for a period of 10 years. The decree was eventually annulled, thanks to the intervention of the Empress Pompeii. The Pompeians were thrilled to see their games reinstated. The gladiators were heroes, even worshipped by children, who used to draw pictures of their favorite fighters on the walls of the city. The gladiators trained and lived in a large palestra that was housed in an arcaded courtyard. It was part of the single complex that also held the Great Theater and the Odeon, a smaller theater or concert hall. For couples who wanted to enjoy a night on the town, this precursor to today's multiplex was the place to go. Plays and concerts were both performed in the Odeon. In Roman times, the Odeon was covered, so theater-goers sitting on the steps could enjoy perfect acoustics. The Great Theater was built into a hill, as had been done in ancient Greece. There was no admission charge for these performances. Rather, they were sponsored like today's public theater, only here it was usually politicians seeking re-election who paid the bill. The plays were always put on during the day. To offer protection from the hot sun, an awning was held up by large poles. This is how the stage once looked. Unlike the theater, this bakery probably couldn't offer its products for free, but the store still saw plenty of business. The ancient inhabitants of Pompeii were great consumers of bread, as everyone could afford it. There was even the so-called dog bread, panes furfurius, which was served in the soup kitchen for the poor. Of course, even the best bread needs something to wash it down. But very few citizens were fortunate enough to have their own well. This column, which is linked to a large central reservoir, was used to distribute water. Records have provided some idea of what this junction looked like. Such fountains were located at many city intersections, where citizens came to draw water they needed for domestic use. The wealthier citizens who lived in Pompeii's most famous houses had it a lot easier. This one is called the House of the Vetii. 2 brothers descended from a family of freed slaves who made their fortunes in business. Eager for ways to show off their wealth, the Vetii family had statues erected in a garden surrounded by columns, and decorated the house with frescoes like these. Another noteworthy residence was the so-called House of the Faun. This luxurious home covered an area of more than 32,000 square feet, almost a whole city block, and was made up of countless rooms. The villa was adorned with many statues. This bronze figure was the centerpiece of what was called the impluvium, a basin used for catching rainwater that came through a hole in the ceiling. The house belonged to a woman named Cassia. Archaeologists found her carbonized body, along with earrings, a ring, and other jewelry held in a small bag. Another grand manor was the Villa of Mysteries, which lay outside the city walls. It was a farm that specialized in the making of local wines with names like Vesuvino. This is a reconstructed wooden press, identical to the ones used 2,000 years ago to crush grapes. However, the last owners of the villa, which takes its name from these frescoes, grew more than grapes. Their farm produced a variety of fruits and vegetables that they sold at the market in Pompeii. In a finding nearly as remarkable as the city itself, archaeologists have discovered the perfectly preserved seeds of many of the plants cultivated in Pompeii. From such evidence, we can see how agriculture played a vital role in the life of Pompeii. Each house had its own vegetable garden. For example, this is the garden of the so-called House of the Perfume Seller. Its owner planted olive trees in orderly rows with carefully tended hedges of myrtle and other shrubs. He also cultivated herbs, roots, and the flowers of many plants that were used as remedies against common illnesses. The Pompeians grew poppy seeds whose sleep-inducing properties they knew about, linen seeds used for poultices to treat bronchitis, or rue, wormwood, and fennel, which were used as they are today for cases of stomachache. Basil was not used in cooking, but to obtain a very delicate perfume that was very popular with women in ancient times. Many plants and flowers were not cultivated for their beauty, but to be used to make perfumes. They were diluted with the oil extracted from green olives, whose properties as a preservative were also known. Then they stored them in small glass jars. The various wines produced in Pompeii would be served in this ancient tavern. There were 118 such establishments in the city, which had a population of just under 10,000 people. In other words, there was one tavern for every 85 people. A famous night spot in Pompeii was the Tavern of Asalina, which lay on the Via dell'Abbondanza. This gives us an idea of what it looked like to its regular customers. Narrow and cramped, the bar was probably renowned not for its wine, but for its women. Their names were Smirina, Maria, and Egli, 3 working girls who were more than willing to supply clients with services of a sexual nature, which in all likelihood took place in a narrow room upstairs. We know one name thanks to writing found on the wall outside the tavern. It's an election poster promoting a candidate for what today would be called a councilman.
Vote Caius Lollius Fusco for Aedile in charge of roads and public and holy buildings. The girls of Asalina, and especially Smirina, call on you for your support.
Evidence suggests that in ancient Pompeii, wine and politics went hand in hand. Elections were held at least 20 times a year to fill various posts, and rich citizens seeking public office weren't above throwing money around to help their campaign. To further their cause, candidates sponsored gladiatorial contests or other forms of entertainment in the amphitheater. Even more persuasive were the huge campaign banquets, Roman orgies to which they invited all potential voters. Naturally, they also put up election posters written on walls in red or black paint, which invited people to vote for a particular candidate with the help of a rather imaginative slogan.
Vote Trebius for Aedile. The bread vendors call on your support. Elect Seius Secundus. He has the Pope's vote.
Or else,
Caius Julius Polybius for Aedile. He makes great bread.
In short, they weren't fussy about how they solicited votes. One wealthy popular baker, Caius Julius Polybius, even had election slogans plastered on the walls of his own home, begging house guests to cast their votes for him. We know what Caius Julius Polybius looked like, as well as two of his presumed relatives. Using advanced reconstructive techniques and working from skull fragments found in the villa, scientists have created a series of model heads that allow us to see the actual faces of Pompeian citizens. Here is Caius Julius Polybius, an aspiring politician in the elections of 79 AD, with his aquiline nose, thin lips, and high, sloping forehead. And this is the face of one of his relatives, a man in his 30s, wide-nosed, bushy eyebrows, standing 5'7", almost a giant for those days. Lastly, a girl, just under 5 feet in height, graceful oval face with large eyes. Imagine her with hair done up in a bun and skin lightly scented with a touch of basil. This person is Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, a banker whose expertise in writing sales contracts made his opinion much sought after. At the other end of the job spectrum was Caius Norbanus Sorice, an actor whose features befit that of a man of the stage. Proving that humor is truly universal, this amusing caricature is of a man named Rufus, a frequent guest at the House of Mysteries. The same human qualities that define us today were alive and well 2,000 years ago. All types of slogans have been found, revealing a people who knew how to look on the absurd side of life and weren't afraid to share a few intimate details about each other.
Salvilla is a big fatty. How can anyone love her?
Was written up on the wall of an ancient laundry, or fulonica. Another malicious gossip tells us that a certain Suavis dreamt of nothing but jugs of wine. And then there are writings of a lover. May Cupid's arrow kill me if I should ever desire to leave you. Written in honor of a beautiful woman by a bachelor endowed with a certain gift for poetry. The inhabitants of Pompeii knew how to get the best out of their simple provincial way of living. But one summer day, the passions, loves, joys, and daily life of the city would change forever by a power and destructive force greater than any Caesar. It's already dark when we reach one of the most important sites of current excavations, known as the Villa of the Chaste Lovers. As you can see from the skeletons of animals still lying here, and from the fallen jugs, this site is like an open book illustrating the dramatic moment of the eruption of Vesuvius. Before the disaster, frescoes adorned this owner's house. There were storerooms and sheds for the animals. Here was an oven and mill. It is because of this site that archaeologists are able to establish an exact date and time of the eruption. On August 24th, 79 AD, at 1 p.m., a dark column of smoke and burning ashes erupts from the volcano's crater. But this devastation is just the beginning. Around 7:30 that evening, a series of violent earthquakes rock the city. All through the night, massive tremors shake the city of Pompeii to its foundations, and citizens flee for their lives. The next morning, despite the damage, many people go back to their homes to try to save their valuables. What they see is a ghost town of empty houses and thousands of lost souls wandering around. The situation during the city's final hours is now revealed by archaeologists, who envision an unending vein of horror. Between 6 and 7 a.m. on August 25th, the most dramatic catastrophe takes place. Masses of volcanic ash and burning gases rise thousands of feet over the crater and then begin to engulf the city. Red-hot sulfurous smoke sweeps down from the side of the volcano at more than 100 miles an hour. It is these dense, choking clouds that suffocate and burn to death the entire population of Pompeii. There is no escape. More than 2,000 people die. And the death toll is still rising as more bodies are uncovered. 250 years after the excavations first began. Covered by tin, this is the body of a boy of about 12. These other bodies are of people who were trying to take cover from the fury of the volcano, their moment of death frozen in time as they tried to escape. How could this entire population have been so unaware of the imminent danger lying in wait? A Greek scientist named Strabon had warned the Pompeians about the risk of an eruption of Vesuvius a full century earlier. And yet, this fresco shows they continued to regard it as a peaceful mountain covered in vineyards and olive trees. Today, as visitors survey the historic streets of Pompeii, the wonders of rediscovering this ancient civilization override the horrors of its tragedy. But it's a bittersweet chapter. The German poet Wolfgang Goethe wrote after his visit here in the 18th century, "Never has any similar tragedy given such joy to the generations that followed." Over 2 million people visit Pompeii every year. They come to see its art and marvel at its architecture, but most of all, to pay tribute to a society not so different from our own. A people who shared the same hopes, ambitions, and passions as we, but with a downfall unlike any other in history. Rome was founded, according to legend, by Romulus in 753 BC. It began its expansion almost immediately, first conquering the lands of the Italian peoples, and then extending its domain until an empire was created that stretched from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia all the way to the Euphrates River. Historians date the fall of the Western Roman Empire to 476 AD, meaning that the history of this city and its dominion over the world spanned an entire millennium. How was it able to last so long? The answer is, Rome not only conquered lands, it adopted them, blending the customs and habits of various civilizations with the best that Rome had to offer. In Vaison-la-Romaine, France, once a Roman province known as Gaul, archaeologists uncovered this paved road bordered by impressive buildings. At its entryways, the researchers noticed some strange grooves. What were they for? When presented with a puzzle like this, archaeologists often find important clues in ancient architectural writings, preserved by medieval scribes. In the case of Vaison-la-Romaine, the mystery was solved. The grooves in the thresholds supported wooden tables where merchants displayed their goods. By positioning the tables along the roadway, merchants enjoyed maximum visibility for their products and therefore had more success. This emphasis on marketing and commerce was one of the reasons why the empire remained vital for so long. Wherever the Romans arrived, weapons were laid down eventually, and the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, took their place. Within this context of renewed stability, business was able to thrive. Eventually, after Rome had invaded and inhabited a new land, it would take the best soldiers of that country and incorporate them into its own army. The best of these recruits would have come from wealthy families. They were usually better educated and trained, with natural aspirations to rise through the system of their new ruling government. If they succeeded in battle and the political aspects of war, they might have the chance to become senator, one of the highest and wealthiest positions in the empire. A military career was the fastest route to furthering one's career. Of course, the new soldiers had to start at the bottom. They would be sent to battles in the easternmost borders of the empire, where Emperor Trajan was fighting the formidable Parni, the heirs of the Persians. From France, they would embark with a small military fleet on a voyage from Massilia, now Marseille, to Sicily, and forced to fight pirates along the way. From Sicily, the voyage would continue to the Orient, following the fastest and safest route possible. This meant following the coastline and only crossing open sea where necessary. The fleet would thread its way across the Aegean through the Peloponnesus to reach the port of Laodicea in Syria. Warships at that time were a lot different than merchant ships. This boat is called a trireme. We know how it looked because of information from relics recovered by marine archaeologists. They discovered that in order to be able to make quick maneuvers in battle and ram the enemy, warships were propelled by several layers of oarsmen. Merchant ships, on the other hand, used sails and had no oars. Warships were classified by the number and arrangement of oarsmen. The trireme had 3 tiers of oars, and each oar was manned by 2 oarsmen. It was a lightweight fighting ship, about 115 feet long, and perfect for hunting pirates because it was fast and agile. Naval soldiers manned the ship together with the oarsmen and were there to board enemy ships. Each trireme had a crew of about 300 oarsmen and 100 naval soldiers. To rid the vast waters of the Mediterranean and the Aegean of pirates, the fleet would often give chase, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to catch its enemy. Once caught, the tactic was not to board the enemy ship and engage in hand-to-hand combat, but to sink it, either by ramming it or hitting it with catapult fire. A ship positioned broadside exposed itself to a greater risk of being rammed and sunk than its attacker, but that position offered advantages for the use of its catapult. This is because the rolling waves had 2 different effects on the arc of the projectiles. The defending ship catapult, positioned perpendicular to the main axis, hurled projectiles that fell inside an elongated ellipse, a form which corresponded perfectly to the shape and position of the attacking ship. The attacking ship, on the other hand, had its catapult aligned with its main axis, and its projectiles tended to fall within a circle that encompassed only a minimal part of the target ship. Oftentimes, the attacker's missiles missed their target, and the tides of battle would shift. A soldier's life was not all war. Roman culture demanded a certain refinement and taste among its subjects. This theater in Tyndaris is on the northeast coast of Sicily, overlooking the sea, where many voyagers and soldiers stopped on their journeys. What is both striking and intriguing about this structure is not so much its architecture or finishings, but rather its location. It is stunning, but it lacks a logical explanation. Having a theater exposed to the sea winds and the full sun, since the shows were offered during the daytime, seemed to be a very questionable choice. Other theaters, such as the very steep one in Pergamum, Turkey, had sweeping horizons to look out onto. That was what Hellenic tastes demanded. Every architectural work had to have something magnificent about it. The Tyndaris Theater, like much of the city, was not actually built by the Romans, but rather by the Greeks several centuries earlier during the Hellenistic era. The Romans simply absorbed it into their empire. One of the reasons for the size and strength of the Roman Empire was its assimilation of Greek culture, which was imitated and developed even further, as in the art of mosaics, and then spread throughout the empire. In the interior of Sicily was a flourishing city, Morgantina. Sumptuous dwellings adorned with splendid mosaics testify to its wealth. One of the ways it demonstrated its prosperity was the gracious hospitality offered to strangers. We see evidence in this mosaic, which contains the Greek phrase, "be well," which may be taken as a sort of welcome. All citizens of the empire were equal. People and ideas were allowed to circulate freely, as were goods. The governor of the island, as well as its year-round inhabitants, would extend the celebrated Roman hospitality to all visitors, offering wine, meat, and all the produce of the fertile Sicilian soil, part of the Italian terra firma, a land that Virgil called an earthly paradise, mighty mother of crops and mother of men. Sometimes an army's mission was not of war, but of peace. On the Greek island of Santorini was an early settlement called Thera. Thera was located in an area that was always at risk for earthquakes. Half of the island disappeared into the sea in the 2nd millennium BC. The archaeological remains of Thera show that the city was rebuilt several times because it was hit by an earthquake more than once. The earthquakes would seriously damage public and private buildings, and on occasion, the Roman army would be assigned to carry out civil engineering projects, digging wells, clearing roads, restoring hygiene. An army officer could distinguish himself further by performing these public duties in a successful fashion. Moving further east, toward the outer reaches of the empire, we enter Jordan. Archaeologists working during the last century uncovered a beautiful city, Gerasa. They were quite puzzled to find numerous drain covers like this one, bearing the engraved image of a dolphin. This animal is clearly associated with the sea, although Gerasa was surrounded by desert and far from the coast. What mysterious meaning did this hide? Excavation work revealed a very rich city over the course of decades and offered clues to archaeologists as to what relationship Gerasa might have had with water. One of the city's most important monuments is the Nymphaeum, an impressively decorated fountain. These channels in the paving stones served to carry away the water. The city was thus laced with small rivulets of water. A sensational discovery emerged from the study of the grand colonnade that crossed the city. At the tops of the columns, encased in the architraves, there were water conduits. Gerasa had a complex water distribution system. The water that filled the streams during the rainy season was diverted, collected, and conveyed all around the city, where it was used ostentatiously before draining off along the various channels. This system was certainly wasteful, but that is precisely why it was a source of pride to the city. With its ample supply of water and its monuments, including this temple dedicated to Zeus built in a panoramic position atop 3 terraces, Gerasa projected an image of beauty and hospitality, as befitted its status as one of the ancient world's most important marketplaces. The city was at the eastern border of the Roman Empire, an area of intense commercial traffic between the Mediterranean to the west and India and China to the east. Gerasa had to compete for commerce with other cities in the same zone, such as Palmyra and Petra, and hence had to offer a wide range of quality services and entertainment, as seen in its 2 theaters, its mineral baths, and the stadium. Its hospitality is highlighted by this magnificent oval plaza, for which Gerasa is world famous. The oval plaza of Gerasa is a symbol of the Roman Empire. An imposing colonnaded avenue penetrates the city and ends in this picturesque plaza. It is clear that the most beautiful and important cities of the empire, even the more distant ones like Gerasa, owed their stature to the excellent routes connecting them. The plaza, or the forum, as the Romans liked to call the city's most important meeting place, was always the end point of a road. This oval plaza stands as a testament to the most important reason for the survival of the Roman Empire, its road system. The efficiency of these road networks could be admired today. There were postal stations, armed guards, constant upkeep of the surface, and over 75,000 miles of roads. Gerasa was the eastern outpost of the empire. From here, Roman soldiers would travel through dunes across a boundless desert and encounter a culture and civilization unlike anything they had ever known. The caustic people who lived in this area between the Euphrates and the Indus rivers made even Romans tremble. This was the land of the Parni, the heirs of the Persians. The Romans would be forced to call upon their formidable battle tactics to defeat this bellicose enemy. There would be 5 or 6 tribunes in command of several divisions. The tribunes would report to a legate of the emperor, the top commander of the legion. Under the tribunes were the centurions, an elite force of men who commanded the centuries, groups of 100 soldiers. When engaging the Parni on the battlefield, the Romans would utilize their well-established military techniques. The cavalry would be deployed along the flanks. In the center, facing the enemy army, there would be 4 rows of infantry, with the centuries in a staggered array to close any gaps. The first to attack were the Velites, a light force that carried out swift strikes and then took refuge behind the lines. Next, the Lancers advanced, hurling their javelins and then engaging in hand-to-hand combat before retreating. And then it was the turn of the Princeps, and lastly, the Triarii, armed with lance and sword. The attacks continued in the same order repeatedly until all 4 lines, flanked by the cavalry, launched the final assault. If they won the first battle, the Romans would face a much more arduous challenge, the siege of a city. The army would camp about half a mile from the walls, and would set these ominous war machines, efficient and effective catapults, upon pedestals. Catapults could shoot arrows, or, when necessary, rocks. When the army laid siege to a city, they used rocks as missiles to break openings in the walls so that the army could invade. The rocks would need to hit the same point again and again. This was achieved by loading the catapult with projectiles of the same weight after carrying out several launch tests and choosing the proper position in which to set the machine. The rocks weighed up to 175 pounds and had a maximum range of 700 yards. In order to launch them at high speed toward the adversary's walls, the rocks were placed in a sack at the center of a rope tied to each of the arms of a bow, held in tension by a system of twisted ropes. A winch drew back the rope, which would then snap forward and hurl the projectile when the ring attached to the sack was released. Along with the catapult bombardment, the Romans would use other war machines as well. The tower was one of their strongest assault weapons. Its sides were closed, but could be opened at different levels when needed. On the intermediate floors, there were catapults armed with arrows and rocks. On the upper floors, there were soldiers ready to make the assault when the towers were next to the enemy walls. On the bottom floor, there was the battering ram. When the wall had been breached, the tribune would give the signal to his centurions to attack and make their victorious entrance into the city. With Trajan's victory over the Parni, the Roman Empire reached its greatest expansion. A well-decorated officer could return home and follow the cursus honorum, the way of honor, a strictly regimented Roman ladder of promotion. With the right battle honors, they could win a much-desired senatorial appointment and sit in on the empire's most important assembly. Roman senators were fighters too, but in a different way. They would use weapons of diplomacy, equitable application of law, and wise economic and political administration to maintain the stability of all that the army had achieved. The empire was an immense domain that encompassed the entire known world at the time. The legacy was one of the most powerful in world history. The pyramids we're most familiar with seeing are the magnificent structures at Giza. But the story of the pyramids originates not in Giza, but 12 miles farther south, in an area known as Saqqara. Today, a silent span of desert separates Saqqara from Giza. But this was once an immense necropolis, the burial place for the inhabitants of Memphis, capital of the ancient kingdom. This is the Step Pyramid, the oldest stone monument in the world. It was built by the pharaoh Djoser around 2600 BC and designed by Imhotep, the first architect whose name would live on in history. Imhotep's design work was so revolutionary and successful at that time that he was later deified, one of the few non-royals to achieve that distinction. Votive statues in his honor are at the Cairo Museum. For the Saqqara Pyramid, Imhotep chose to layer 6 mastabas, low rectangular stone structures normally erected over tombs, one on top of the other, to reach an overall height of almost 200 feet. Pharaoh Djoser had a stone portrait of himself placed in the serdab, a sealed chamber in the pyramid. And he had 2 holes made in the wall so that he could observe the outside world for all eternity. His is the first life-size stone portrait in the history of mankind. The original is also in the Cairo Museum. Unfortunately, his face was mutilated and irreparably damaged during the robbery of gemstones which were set in the orbit of his eyes. The Saqqara Pyramid is surrounded by several beautifully built constructions that emulate in stone the sheaves of rushes and matting used for ceilings in the houses of nearby Memphis. The ancient city is now completely buried over. Only some palm trees, sand, and a small farming community exist where the great city once stood. At Saqqara, a huge wall surrounded the sacred area of the pharaoh's tomb. The wall was over half a mile long and almost 50 feet high. The 14 stone doors that can be seen along the wall were all false, except for one, the real point of access, which faced south. To get to the sacred area, worshippers had to walk down a long avenue lined with 40 sculpted columns, which would have originally been painted. Their shape recalls the sheaves of straw and reeds used to protect brick columns. This passage gave access to the interior of the complex, to the courtyards, chapels, and sanctuaries. Even though they were modeled to give the impression of real buildings, they are mainly imitations set with false doors. At the end of the avenue is the large interior courtyard with the pyramid rising up in the center, the first noble stone construction created for one man. A man who was concerned the world would forget him. A man who ensured it would not. Besides the monuments of pharaohs and princesses, there were many high officials who wanted to build their own tomb in Saqqara, like the tomb of Ti. The mastaba of Ti, where his wife and son were also buried, is one of the largest and most richly endowed tombs in the Saqqara necropolis. It is possible to gain access to Ti's burial chamber from the courtyard by means of a long, sloping passageway that leads to an underground crypt, where Ti's sarcophagus is preserved in a starkly decorated chamber. The extreme simplicity of this room is in stark contrast to the rich decorations found in the rest of the mastaba. The upper chambers in the tomb are decorated with a series of figures portraying scenes from the daily lives of the dead man and his family. Ti was an important state official, inspector of the pyramids of Abu Sir, as well as being the official court hairdresser. And here, emerging from the past, is the statue of Ti, seen as it was at the time of the pharaohs almost 5,000 years ago. More than 80 pyramids have been rediscovered in Egypt, all of them built on the western bank of the Nile, the side where the sun goes down. South of Saqqara, near the oasis of Fayum, archaeologists discovered a pyramid of historical importance because of its unique features. The pyramid at Meidum, built for the pharaoh Snefru, founder of the 4th dynasty. Why is this pyramid different from all the others? The monument was originally a step pyramid, like the one in Saqqara. But here in Meidum, the architects working for the pharaoh Snefru believed they had found the secret of the perfect form. They would abandon the previous step structure, fill in the platforms, and make the line of the pyramid smooth and sloping. It was a revolutionary concept. But something went wrong. The bases of the 4 external supporting walls fell in, and the blocks of limestone slipped downward, revealing the internal part that we see today. Like the pyramid in Saqqara, the Meidum pyramid was also surrounded by tombs of princes and dignitaries. The statues of Prince Rahotep and his wife, on display at the Cairo Museum, were found here. When archaeologists discovered the statues of Rahotep and Nofret, the workers taking part in the dig were terrified by their intense expression, which they believed was too lifelike to be that of mere statues. Pharaoh Snefru had another pyramid built, the Pyramid of Dashur, universally known as the Bent Pyramid. Dashur is the modern name of this area south of Saqqara. Another monumental construction, it was worked on by thousands of builders and dozens of architects. While a step pyramid may have provided a stair by which the king ascended to heaven after his death, the true pyramids probably reflect a change to a solar cult, symbolizing the sun's rays radiating down. This construction was the first one to be designed from the very beginning as a true pyramid with smooth, sloping sides. However, when the pyramid had reached about half of its planned height, the angle of the external walls was abruptly reduced, thus creating its characteristic bent profile. The reasons behind this surprising decision have intrigued scholars for centuries. The hypothesis seems to be that the architects preferred to reduce the angle in order to avoid overloading the structure by excessively sloping the sides of the pyramid. This pyramid is one of the most important in ancient Egypt, as well as being the only one that has preserved its original limestone casing. The lessons learned by Snefru's architects were absorbed by the architects working for his son, Pharaoh Cheops, who built the pyramid that was to become one of the 7 wonders of the world. It is north on the Nile that we find the area where perhaps the most exciting chapter in the story of the pyramids took place. On the outskirts of Cairo, the modern-day capital of Egypt, is a small village called Giza. Giza grew up in a haphazard fashion in the recent Egyptian population explosion. In Egypt, a new baby is born every 20 seconds. Cairo now has a population of over 15 million inhabitants. And yet, Giza is a suburb unlike any other, because wherever you look, you see the imposing bulk of a pyramid. On this plateau, set on the edge of the desert, the story of the pyramids achieved its finest hour. It is here that we best appreciate the grandeur and majesty of these constructions, and the organizational skills and methods used to erect them. The workers here were organized into teams that hauled blocks of stone on huge sleds mounted on logs of wood. Each team was made up of about 1,000 men, organized along military lines and led by a master mason and various underlings. They were not slaves. They earned a regular wage, bed, and board. It is thanks to their work that these immense structures were ever completed. Even today, such imposing buildings would involve complex engineering problems. The Great Pyramid of Cheops, which was the first one to be built in Giza about 2500 BC, has a base that covers over 12 acres, and each side is longer than 2 football fields. But here's what's amazing. The base is leveled off so perfectly that there is never more than an inch of error. How did they do this? This level of precision was achieved with simple measuring rods and lines of cords, and by observing the sun and the stars. They might also have employed the use of spirit levels for the horizontal lines. More than 2,300,000 blocks of stone were needed to build the base. They weigh between 2 tons and 200 tons each. It may sound incredible, but this was once a lush green land with neither desert nor buildings here. Irrigation canals linked the area to the Nile, and some of the stones used in building were transported on these canals. A boat made with cedar wood, built almost 5,000 years ago, was discovered here in 1954 near the Pyramid of Cheops, still in a perfect state of preservation. Archaeologists found it belonged to the Pharaoh Cheops himself. 140 feet long, equipped with 12 oars. It was probably used by Cheops when he traveled along the Nile. On those occasions, his subjects could get a glimpse of their pharaoh and pay homage to him. Originally, the pyramids were covered in a very smooth limestone casing, which can be seen at the Pyramid of Khafre only at its tip. It was so smooth that the 1st century Roman historian Pliny described how local inhabitants used to have fun sliding down the steep sides of the pyramids. According to the historian Herodotus, more than 100,000 men worked for almost 10 years just to build the causeway that ran from the river to the plateau on which the Pyramid of Cheops stands. And yet, such lavish and grandiose undertakings were not always appreciated. The enemies of Pharaoh Cheops spread a rumor that the pharaoh forced his daughter into prostitution in order to make up the necessary funds. This may or may not be true. What we do know is that Cheops was not very popular with his subjects, which is perhaps why this tiny statue in the Cairo Museum is the only one of this powerful pharaoh that has survived. The whole complex was later expanded with the construction of 2 other pyramids, which then, as now, added to its majestic grandeur. Khafre, the son of Cheops, built a pyramid that was slightly lower than his father's, but looks higher because it's built on top of a small plateau. Then Mycerinus, the last pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, erected the smallest of the 3 pyramids, which is 213 feet high. Though they're majestic from the outside, going inside the pyramids is an extraordinary experience. Access to the Pyramid of Cheops is through a rough passageway that was dug out at the side of the pyramid in the 9th century to enable the followers of the Caliph al-Ma'mun to reach the burial chamber and steal its treasures. In 1001 Nights, there is a description of the magical riches of the pharaohs. Inside the Western Pyramid are granite chambers filled with precious gems, unimaginable quantities of gold coins, and magnificent instruments and arms spread with miraculous ointments to prevent them from rusting until Judgment Day. A steep climb inside the pyramid brings you to the burial chamber of Pharaoh Cheops. Only the king's austere granite sarcophagus remains, empty, damaged, and with the cover missing. Centuries and centuries ago, unknown hands rifled all the contents without the least respect for the pharaoh's mummified body. In ancient Egypt, mummifying bodies spread over time from being the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh to a practice followed by large groups of the population. It represented continuity of life after death. For this ancient civilization, the soul and the body were considered to be of equal importance. Thus, one needed to be well prepared for the afterlife. More than 500 million people were born and died during the reign of the pharaohs, and most of them were mummified. Each of them received funeral honors that were proportionate to their wealth. In fact, the treatment was available in luxury, mid-range, and economy versions. The mummification procedure took from 20 to 70 days, during which the internal organs were removed and the body was dehydrated. Special terracotta containers were used to conserve the lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines. The brain was thrown away, as the ancient Egyptians believed that it was of no use. Embalming was then carried out to toughen the skin. The corpse was often filled with mud and sawdust to help maintain its shape. Then it was wrapped in layers and layers of linen bandages. Lastly, the mummy was enclosed in a wooden sarcophagus. This is the mummy of the great Ramses II, the warrior pharaoh who erected more statues and buildings than any other Egyptian king. It is on display alongside other pharaohs and princesses in the Cairo Museum. Pyramids and the images of mummies that inhabited them are not the only draw at Giza. This statue of the great Sphinx has inflamed the imaginations of men throughout the ages, a statue of mystery and enigma. The Sphinx is the largest outdoor sculpture in the ancient world. It portrays a sitting lion with a human head, perhaps that of Pharaoh Khephren, and faces the rising sun in the east. Carved out of the bare rock, its dimensions are gigantic, 65 feet high and 187 feet long. The nose alone measures 5 feet. The face has been damaged on many occasions, by the arrows fired by the Mameluke artillery, by the desert winds, and even by the cannons of Napoleon's army. Sandstorms have eroded the statue in various areas, and Cairo's severe pollution levels are a serious threat for the Sphinx. It has undergone restoration on several occasions to prevent further deterioration. When it was built, it was resplendent with color. It wore a nemes, the royal headdress with the sacred serpent, and it was painted in very bright colors. The face was red, and the false beard worn by every pharaoh was yellow and blue. Even today, the reasons behind the construction of this enormous statue remain a bit of a mystery. according to Greek tradition, those unable to solve the puzzle of the Sphinx were devoured. But others feel the Sphinx was built simply to guard the Great Pyramids of Giza. It seems to have carried out this job well, as the pyramids are the only structures of the 7 wonders of the world that are still standing today. After Giza, the pharaohs focused on building temples like the ones in Karnak or Luxor. These structures, however, cannot be compared to the perfect forms of the pyramids, the man-made mountains that confirm the unity of earth and heaven. The great complex at Giza remains one of the supreme architectural and logistical achievements of the human race. The pharaoh Cheops left us with these words: "My pyramid shall be an indestructible monument, such as none has been created in God's time. It shall bear my name, and shall be an eternal cry that will say for all time, Cheops is he who from now on will belong forever to the universe." He has certainly left us a monument to enthrall us for eternity.